my audience kind of knows that I work with the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual body.
Yes.
And we were discussing before that, there's such aspects of these parts and how all of the mental, emotional, and spiritual all need that physical body to manifest. It's in sensation.
Yes.
And how much sometimes the opposition that we put against, which is really two halves of a whole.
Yes.
We make them enemies.
Yeah.
That's physical and that spiritual part. And yet if we demonize or let go of the spiritual or the physical, we lose access to that spiritual.
Yeah.
So tell me your experience with that.
So I'm really interested that that's something you've sort of come to and been exploring, because it's very similar to my own path. So, I grew up in a, fundamentalist Christian background where Charles Darwin was a really bad guy. And we were not allowed to believe in evolution or anything like that. But when I was older, I was really interested in science, biology, and I became very interested in evolution.
Yeah.
And when my Sunday school teacher said, "Oh, you either believe in God or evolution," I thought, okay, I'm 14, 4 years, and I'm out of here.
Right.
But many years later, when I was doing a lot of research in psychology, I realized that one of the ways people are talking about the brain is to talk about the human brain as having three components. A reptilian brain or fish brain or bird brain, sometimes people say.
Yes.
Which in a sense is in evolutionary terms, is the oldest brain. In some ways, it's the part that operates fastest.
Right.
People think of it as the most primitive, but in another way, it's had a lot more time to be perfected, right?
Yes.
So we have this reptilian brain, we have a mammalian brain, and when you think what happened when mammals developed, well, the mother-child bond becomes important, and the herding bond becomes important, and so then you realize, it sort of makes sense that has to do with the emotional self.
Yes.
And then the primate brain develops, which in some ways has to do with, we often think of it having to do with rationality, which I think is one of its capacities.
Right.
Analysis, foresight, hindsight, all of those more intellectual capacities. Well, what struck me is this. Here's been sort of my unfolding thing that I think matches up with what you're saying. So in a way, the only route for the human or primate brain and the mammal brain to the body is through that reptilian brain. And in a sense, the reptilian brain is what gives us connection to our body.
Yeah.
So here's my proposal. And again, for what it's worth.
I'm ready.
That if those three parts of our brain, layers of our brain, modules of our brain, they're not easy to manage. We're not very good at it. It causes us all kinds of trouble.
Right.
And maybe what we call spirituality is the way that we integrate those parts of us.
Wow.
So in that way, see, with what a lot of us grew up with, spiritual was good and physical was bad.
Right.
But in this way, no. Spiritual is the way we integrate the different parts of us. And we do it hopefully consciously and with moral ends in mind.
Right.
And that's all. So that's all.
I love it. And I, in the spiritual body, when I go into the food that these different areas need, that spiritual body thrives on ceremony and ritual.
Yes.
And that's what's so beautiful, because ceremony and ritual isn't about logical and linear.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And we're losing that a little bit.
Yes.
We're losing that need. I tell people, even when I went to go see my son graduate from high school, there's a certain song that's played, there's certain clothing that's performed. Yes. I don't know what the significance or symbolism of that is. It's been lost.
Yes.
And I think when we've lost that fuel for the spiritual body, then that spiritual body's become more secular or become something, or become linear or logical.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about a lot of our problems is that if some of us, if we don't have any spirituality that helps us consciously manage these different parts of us, then for some of us, the more reptilian parts of ourselves
Right.
dominate, which might have to do with aggression, territoriality, sex, food.
Yeah.
Others of us, maybe it's just fear of what other people think of us,
Yeah.
that more herd instinct. And others of us, it's this cold rationality or whatever. So there are all kinds of ways it can go wrong, and then we try to find ways for it to go right, and or to at least be conscious about it,
Right.
and in a sense feel some sense that we're actually players in this. We're not just victims of it. And when you think about rituals and ceremonies that develop, these things develop and they have staying power because they help people in some way. So, for better or worse,
Right.
maybe. Some of
Right.
them may be
Right.
rituals that make us more violent
Right.
or more passive or more vicious or something. But even so, we realize, in some ways, that's the term I use for it. I think about it as desire formation. We're choosing which desires we desire to strengthen, which we desire to redirect, that kind of thing.
And I think it's funny that you say that. I love that idea, because that reptilian brain is that quick, and that's where the trauma is.
Yeah.
And so if we when that when those traumatic events happen, then it causes this trauma within us, and then it messes our system. The whole thing gets.
Can I give you two
Yes.
examples of that from my own experience?
Yes.
So on a positive side, I'm a fly fisherman, and I've been doing it a long time. I love it. It requires a lot of coordination.
Yeah.
And I'm always surprised at how my body knows how to do it.
Wow.
It's not that I'm thinking, I've got to have this
Right.
angle and this much. It's a rhythm, and it's a
Right.
kind of physical intelligence. You
Right.
watch someone who does ballet or gymnastics or anything that involves physicality.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're consciously thinking about it. It's that the body learns how to do it.
Yes.
Faster than conscious thought.
Yeah. Right.
And but a few years ago, I was asked to speak at a seminary, and 4 people showed up at this just to disrupt it. They didn't like me. They didn't like what I stood for. And so they glared at me the whole time. As soon as we'd open up for questions, they'd ask a really snarky question with just disdain in their voice. It's a 3-day intensive course. I get to the end. I go back to my room. I feel a little itching on my stomach, and I open my shirt. And within 20 minutes, I'd broken out in hives from my head to my toe. And I realized I have not been around snarky, mean-spirited, religious people like that. And my body was saying to me, never put yourself in that situation, or it was saying, this caused me a lot of stress.
Right.
So,
It was a little rude awakening for myself when I realized that those minorities, or those that are, that's their everyday life.
oh my gosh, to realize that everyone probably, there are certain things that cause them so much stress, but to be, a person of color in a predominantly white society, or to be gay in a predominantly straight society, or whatever, and that would be setting off the most, in a certain sense, we call it the most primitive, but the most highly developed part of our system.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, and that's where, when we become that we, or oneness, that's when we can take that in. I loved your idea of the tree and each layer encircling the next layer.
Yes.
And it reminds me of, in your 3rd season of your podcast.
Yeah.
And your 2nd, I think it was episode 4. So it was working with talking to Valerie.
Valerie Kaur, yes.
And we were on a bike ride. I had my little earbuds in listening, and I cried out loud, it was like, because that story is the epitome of wholeness to me.
Yeah.
Because she, in her darkest moment, the most, a climactic moment in her life, and I want people to go and listen to the podcast, so I don't want to give too much away, but when she meets this woman, and she herself has this most profound experience.
Yes.
But yet doesn't leave where she was at to take on that experience.
Yes.
And then the woman that was the organist had this experience with her, didn't leave.
Yes.
They all brought all
Yes.
of who they were, all of the wholeness. And I loved how Valerie incorporated that in never once did I sense in her a question of whether she was going to stay who she was, her sick religion,
Yes.
even though she had this profound experience over here.
That's right.
She held on to her wholeness.
Yes.
And I think, and then in the next second I thought, what if that moment had been something different?
Yeah.
How many lives would be different?
Yeah.
Because she is so influential and so kind and so embracing of people.
Oh,
what would that be like if that moment didn't happen for her?
Oh my gosh, you just think, yeah, and this is where we look back in our history and we realize these colonizing tendencies.
Yes.
Where people went in and said, convert to my religion
Right.
and my culture, or die or be banished or whatever. And we realize, oh my gosh, so much was lost. Mm-hmm. The world would be so much richer. And then we think, well, it's our responsibility now to, in a sense, give other people the same, what's the word? I want to use the word right, but I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a better word. The same dignity
Mm-hmm.
of being able to say, look, I have a childhood. I was born to certain parents. I was
Right.
born in a certain place, in a certain religion, a certain culture, and a certain
Yeah.
language. And, I can never change that.
Mm-hmm.
I can try to hide it. I can
Yeah.
feel ashamed of it. I can double down on it and say it's the best and everything else is terrible.
Right.
But learning how to integrate that and make space for other people to integrate our past, it's big.
And what would it, like if, just listening to her talk about her rituals and ceremonies,
Yeah.
when someone teaches you the beauty of what it is,
Yeah.
it will enrich me, regardless of the name, regardless of the logistics of it, right?
Can I tell you a story about
Yes.
that? So for folks who don't know the backstory, Valerie is a member of the Sikh, or Sikh as she calls it, religion, from a section of India, Kashmir, that whole area of the world, which has a fascinating history and story like every other religious
Right.
tradition. But she was telling me a few years ago that one of her very dearest friends is a Christian, and their friendship through the years, it was very deep, and her friend was dying of cancer. And there's a Sikh tradition that the beloveds of someone who dies, after the person dies, they stay with the body and they wash the body and then
Wow.
wrap it for burial.
Wow.
And, we don't, in my culture, we let funeral directors do
Right.
that. And we let, so this Christian woman, when she died, she said to Valerie, would you gather these
Wow.
friends and wash my body and prepare it for burial?
Wow.
And I just thought, what a beautiful from all different
Right.
directions,
Yeah, again, embracing it instead of dividing.
Yeah.
Embracing more and growing more rather than dividing.
I'm just guessing, but I have a feeling that woman, first, she had grown to be so deeply connected to Valerie that she saw the beauty in Valerie's life and Valerie's tradition and thought this would be a fitting end to our relationship in this life. But I also think it may be that she would have said, as a Christian, we don't have a ritual that's as good for our departure as my friend does.
Right.
And she's generous and would be happy to share it with me.
Right,
So.
right. I love that. I love that. And you work with so many people that are, having that trauma. They're feeling some trauma with religion.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, in reading your books and your podcasts, I think that's the truth of what you've done is gathered and held space for everyone in every place. And so how has that been meeting people, and how does it feel inside your own body when you're, at the beginnings of that? What was that like to make that transition? Because it's a progress. I'm sure at first it was, in a way, almost physically painful because it was different. Maybe?
Yeah, sure. Especially, because of the background I was brought up in. We were taught everybody's going to hell who isn't part of our religion. And we were given the intimation that the devil might be working through them and, in fact, might try to tempt us away from the truth to join their false religion. And so, there's suspicion and almost a feeling if I actually love someone on their own terms of a different tradition, I'm being disloyal to my own.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I had all of that. But I think one of the things that happened to me is I'm so fortunate and blessed and grateful in this that my own sort of Christian reawakening centered on Jesus and Jesus' great commandment to love God and love neighbor. So I always found it hard to feel guilty about loving somebody as I would like to be loved. And so through the years, I had, a series of relationships like that. But I'll just tell you a quick anecdote in that regard. Shortly after, a couple of years after September 11th, 2001, I was invited to be part of a gathering of Christians and Muslims. And there was a special banquet set up. And I arrived 5 minutes early. Nobody was in the room.
Right.
So I'm walking around, feeling awkward. And finally, I just sit down at one of the tables thinking, maybe I've got the wrong time or people are going to show up. And then another guy comes in, and this is horrible to say, but I mean, I guess it's not that. He looked exactly like Osama bin Laden. He looked like an Osama bin Laden lookalike contest. And it turned out he was from Oman, which is where Osama bin Laden, and had the same sort of traditional dress.
Yeah.
And he comes in, looks a little awkward, walks over and says with a perfect New Jersey accent, "Hey, man, can I sit down next to you?" And it turns out he was from Oman, but had gone to college in New Jersey and lived in New Jersey. Yeah. We ended up having this great talk. But you realize, in spite of all the work I've done in this area, I had a physical reaction when I saw him of a little chill because that reptilian part of me that it is trained to protect me, keep me alive. And I'd seen enough pictures on TV of somebody who my brain imprinted is dangerous. And so I had that danger response. Yeah. And we ended up having a great conversation.
Yeah. And that's something I think in the West, I've learned for me, myself, that the East has taught me is to sit and be with those feelings so that I do recognize when that comes up and say, that's happening. And maybe it never goes away. But I think I wasn't even paying attention to when that happened before. You just went full in.
Yeah, what would have happened if I believed that was from God?
Right.
This is God telling me that person is horrible.
Right.
And so then, of course, I wouldn't be friendly to them. And guess what? If I'm not friendly to them, I'm not going to think they're friendly to me. Right. And it would reinforce.
A whole different. Yeah. And what was left, what a shame would be that great conversation.
Exactly right. And I'll tell you, in that light, you think about like in the Gospels when Jesus, for example, tells the story of the Good Samaritan. There's a crossing of a literal street to make contact with someone who's other and who's seen as dirty. Yes. But that the fact that Jesus would tell a story like that, it feels like it's preparing us to cross those social boundaries. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in your book, this latest book, Do I Stay Christian? And I think you've talked about it before, but you talk about these periods of time that even Christianity or even religion has gone through, and that we're kind of in its new era. Yeah. Teach us a little bit about that.
Well, there was a fellow about 100 years ago, a European philosopher named Karl Jaspers. And Karl Jaspers made the observation that if we say the Buddha arises, I think it's around 800 BC, and the Greek philosophers, 300s, obviously a couple centuries before and after, but Plato and Aristotle and so on. And then you go up to Jesus. So he says there's this period from 800 to about the time of Christ where in the Far East, the Middle East, there is this breakthrough of individual consciousness. And he proposed that before that, everyone was so deeply embedded in their tribe or their clan or their group that, for example, you wouldn't think I could change religions because I'm a member of this tribe. It's who I am.
Yeah.
And this is our religion. We worship this God or these 5 gods or whatever, and they don't. And so there's this feeling that the individual didn't even have permission to imagine separating from the group. And what, in a sense, you go back to the story of the Buddha is brought up in a rich, princely family where the assumption is that there's reasons why he has those privileges, and those other people, there are reasons why they're poor and sick. And he makes an individual difference. And he says, I'm not going to stay in that group. I'm going to leave. And among the Jews, Abraham leaves his fatherland. And and the Greek philosophers are doing individual thinking and differing with each other and having schools of philosophy. And he calls this the first axial age. Axial like an axis, the world turns.
Wow.
And so now individual thinking becomes and in a certain sense we might say that
new brain.
That human primate brain or the kind of intellectual self, in a certain sense, starts to flower, and maybe even predominates, gradually. And then in the 20th century, Jasper said, I think that story has run its course, because now we're having to figure out, okay, we can all be individuals. How do we live together? And he didn't go, that was his sort of big idea. A few decades later, a Catholic theologian named Ewart Cousins picked up on the idea, and he thought that something similar was happening theologically. Among other things, as a Catholic, he couldn't just think, we Catholics are going to heaven, everybody else is damned. Vatican II in the Catholic Church repudiated that long-held notion. And so he said, we're thinking about how we connect and relate to each other again. More recently, a dear friend, Franciscan nun and brilliant scholar named Ilia Delio, she has continued to develop that idea. And really the idea of ecology, in a certain sense, says not only do we have to take other people seriously, but gosh, we have to take our connection to the earth and our capacity to destroy the earth. So some people are calling this a second axial age, but another big shift in human consciousness or culture or values.
And I mean, I felt it in my life. I wasn't one to, I just was happy in my little circle, my little box, and then I've worked with many people where you realize when the box was nice, I could lean on it every once in a while. I had somewhere to go. When that box breaks apart, it feels like you're falling through this. It feels like you're falling. But I say, really, you're just floating. You're just. And it takes a minute, and it takes a lot of effort to pay attention to those sensations, what's really telling me and getting familiar with, because fear can be fear get away, or it can be fear of unknown and move forward, and to get very fine-tuned on those sensations.
Yes, that's right.
Are very important, because totally different. And before I was not fine-tuned. It was very easily black and white.
It's funny, as you say that, what comes to mind is you imagine how your body knows if you're, I live in Southwest Florida, and I once came upon a Florida panther, which is not really dangerous. There's, I don't think, ever been an attack of a panther on a person, of a Florida panther on a person. Obviously in California and so on, it's different. But what was interesting is my body, all the hairs on the back of my neck, of course I don't have any on my head, but they all rise. And before I could think about it, I was walking down this path. There's a panther. I turned around and started walking the other way, like it was just my body knew that's a danger. Get yourself away. That's predator. You're prey. But there's a totally different feeling that I'm sure all felt when we're in a room and we smell smoke, or you just feel I'm not getting enough oxygen in here. And it's very subtle, and you keep trying to ignore it, but eventually you say, I got to do something about that. And part of, the way we stay alive is by listening to our body. And it's that set of physical reactions, as you say, that are telling us there's danger.
Message. The message. So a lot of people a lot of people, when they are lost in that break from religion or whatever, kind of move, and they'll say, I'm spiritual, not religious. And some of them even come into the metaphysical sides of things. Why do you think that's so?
Well, I think, for a lot of people, two things happen in institutional religion, whatever the religion. One is that a set of dogmas and practices are identified at some point, 1800s, 1600s, 1200s, or farther back. And those rituals, practices, taboos, rules are carried on, but nobody really understands why. Like almost always in their original context, there was a reason for it, or there was a meaning to it to make us different from those people over there or something. Right. And hundreds of years pass, and you just think, this makes no sense.
What was that again?
And so that's part of it. And then I think also part of it is that in every institution, this isn't just religion, this is politics and business and everything else. The employees of the company can care way more about themselves and their security than and the future of the organization than they do about the mission of the organization and the well-being of the customers or clients or employees or whatever else. So this sense that when institutions only care about their own wealth, power, prestige. So, a classic example is the pedophilia scandals where churches act to protect their own clergy more than children. So I think you put those two things together and people just say, I really can't trust any institutions. I think in the long run, they'll find out that anything that lasts longer than a generation needs an institution. But I also think that, and I think for many people, they have to leave the institution because it's abusive and there's no room for them to breathe. But I think eventually people sort out that it's not institutions that are bad, it's institutionalism that's bad. So.
I think in that conversation you have, you say there's this kind of how do we hold it together? How do we hold it together? And that's where I love your, and I have my own stages, like your own development, and for me, I love your 4 stages. I want to talk about that. I myself, it's not really my own, but I took Fowler's phases. However, right in the middle, I added a heartache. I call it a heartache.
Yes.
Because sometimes it comes from within an institution. Sometimes it's health. Usually at this point in evolution of our species, usually it takes some heartache.
Yes.
And I hope that's not always the case, but that just seems to be the catapult for people to move into a more mature faith. And I even say faith, not just faith as a religious thing, but faith in my own abilities follows those things. Faith in my partner, faith in my, just the idea of faith as a whole. We'll always go through these, these phases. But I liked your simplified phases. And so tell us a little bit about those.
Sure. So first, I'm a big fan of Fowler, as you know. And so I had been reading in intellectual and personal and faith development in a lot of different fields for a long time. And I wanted to figure out a way to try to get it as simple as I could, but having enough nuance. So I have 4 stages: simplicity, complexity, perplexity, harmony. And I'll just tell you, you may have found this already, but there are some other people who, in working with Fowler's work, the term they use instead of heartache is they talk about hitting the wall. So it's funny how a lot of people are saying it's very often there's some sort of crisis or series of crises that make a break with the early stages and make moving forward into something new necessary. But the big idea, to simplify it, to present it very briefly, simplicity is dualism. We learn to sort the world into us, them, good, bad, right, wrong, safe, dangerous, poison, edible, that sort of thing. Familiar, weird, like, dislike, which is necessary for our survival. But a lot of people stay there their whole lives. They, in a certain sense, reach that at age 8 or 10, and they spend the rest of their lives liking and disliking and hating and loving and judging and accepting and all the rest. Which I guess maybe they never have any pain that drives them out of that or experience that does. A lot of people move into complexity where you say, hold it, I was taught that people of my political party were good and people of their political party are bad, but this guy in our party is a jerk and that guy in their party is really nice. And so suddenly the world is complexified. And some of the complexity is learning how to explain those things away and then how to make allowances and exceptions. The way I say it is we all get this dualistic contract and then we start adding fine print. And
isn't that pain? It's a painful experience sometimes.
That's true.
It's like another bias. We can talk about that. Another bias I'm hitting up against.
Yeah, and that's very complex, and it's also exciting.
Right. Exciting like a roller coaster.
Yeah, and like a challenge. You know? And we can feel like we're good soldiers because any argument that comes against our group, no matter how hard, we'll find a way to refute it.
Right.
And a lot of people stay there at stage 2 complexity their whole lives. And then I think more and more of us at a younger and younger age hit that heartache that pushes us into perplexity, where you could say that simplicity is dualistic, complexity is pragmatic. How do I make this work? How do I succeed?
Right.
And then I think what happens in perplexity is we say, you know what? My group, we think we're right. That group, they think they're right. Gosh, we're all kind of just living in our little bubbles, and we become critical of everybody, including ourselves. So you could say that perplexity is critical. It's about critical thinking. You could also say it becomes skeptical and relativistic, meaning everybody's just, they're working in their own story.
Right.
And the problem for that, I think it's exciting. I like to say to people, stage 3 is graduate school. Because, and when you think about it, when you're an undergraduate, you read textbooks that make it sound like everybody in our field agrees.
Yes.
You get to graduate school, you read the original sources, and you find out that there's arguments in your profession and field. And so I remember when I was in graduate school and I learned, I was a lit major. Some people don't think Shakespeare existed. What? You know? And, but then you find out there's all kinds of reasons why that is. But the problem for religious people is that there are very, very, very few religious communities that make room for people in stage 3. They tell them there's something wrong with them. And then I think a lot of people stay there their whole lives. But I think more and more people at a younger and younger age are moving into what I call stage 4, harmony or solidarity, where they say, you know what, the stage 1 people, that's just where they are, and the stage 2 people. And the stage, when I've been in stage 3, that's where I want to get to a place where I don't just have to criticize everybody for being hypocrites or whatever. I have to develop some compassion for everybody, including myself.
Right.
So.
It reminds me of a story when I don't know which stage I was moving into, but it happened in a split second for me. And I was in my backyard, and it was one of those deeply painful moments, those times where you look to the heavens and you just, and I couldn't speak. So I took my finger and I just started to write, help. on
Yes.
the ground, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
And all of a sudden I looked at that, which wasn't even there really, the H-E-L-P.
Yeah.
And I realized that depending on your perspective, H-E-L-P meant go and help or please help. The perfect opposites
Wow.
of the meaning
Yes.
existing exactly at the
Wow.
same time.
Wow.
And everything kind of just opened, I just went,
That makes so much sense. Yeah.
okay. And that was such a pivotal moment for
Wow.
me.
I can see in that moment you were acknowledging your need for help. It was maybe something like a prayer or just a cry from your heart.
Yes.
But it was also then this realization, hold it, if I need this help, other people need this help.
Yeah.
And maybe in getting the help I need, I'll be able to help them.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It was.
You gave yourself permission.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, it was a validation in my terms. I'm in stage 3 and I deserve some help here.
Right. And it just became this circular thing to receive help, give and receive.
Yeah.
And where do you start? It's just a circular. It's
My goodness. And can I say something that really connects to what we were talking about before?
Yeah.
If in what those people call the first axial age, the idea is, I've got to get salvation for me.
Right.
I've got to get enlightenment for me. I've got to get righteousness for me. At that moment, it was like help for me and help for everybody else. It was the same. It was the same help,
Right.
Which was, to me, that's why I sometimes use the word solidarity for that fourth stage, because it's where we start realizing, our interconnectedness.
And I honor every people that are in their stages. You have to recognize. I have to recognize my own sensations of resistance, to put a hierarchy to it, or whatever. But for myself, what a difference my little life had on a daily basis when I could walk into the gas station and speak with the person across the counter in a whole different way of interacting and feel that oneness, feel just deep love.
Yeah.
And also recognize where I would have made the judgments,
Yes.
and really feel those judgments not there anymore.
Yes. And this is where I think, your concern about hierarchy is a smart concern, because I don't think we're even thinking about stages in a wise way if we think about them as a hierarchy at all. In a sense, what we're saying is there are capacities that you need to develop before you develop other capacities, because the other capacity builds on the previous capacity. And since we're all born or raised in a group, and that group protects us and teaches us, and we're dependent on them, of course we don't criticize them. We try to learn from them. And we resist them and everything else too. But there comes a point where, unless we happen to have been born into the one perfect group, if we don't learn to criticize the group that we're part of, and so if we don't learn to criticize it, we perpetuate the harm, right? So you can see that it's not that one's better than the other. It's just that skills are cumulative.
Right.
Yeah.
And we are so quick to criticize and to want to improve ourselves. And yet within a group, we kind of just don't let that, we don't take those same rules and move them into the bigger group.
Yeah.
And yet, how can we grow if we just stay in, that's to me, that's the definition of damnation.
Wow. Yes.
It's to not grow.
Yeah.
And so when will we stop growing? Hopefully never.
Hopefully never. Yeah.
And so what that means is I have a whole lot I don't know right now.
Yeah.
And that can be a place for me to be humble and also excited for what's more to come.
Beautifully
at
said.
the same time.
And what a beautiful space, to be, and what a beautiful space to create for other people, because a lot of people are in places where they're told, don't think, don't ask questions, which is another way of saying, don't grow. At least don't grow beyond what we consider acceptable. It raises a question that I don't know the answer to about stages that relates to the heartache you were bringing up. What would happen if we had parents who, in these terms I'm using,
Yeah.
were in stage 4,
Right.
and they saw it their job to help me learn to get as close to
Yes.
where they are as possible.
Yes.
It would be very different than if you had parents who were in stage 1 and were nervous about you going any farther. And this might be one of those things we just don't know. If that happens, it may be that people won't talk about stages anymore.
Right. But that's the key. I mean, for me, I'm hoping for 2 and 3 generations
Yeah.
down the road.
To be in a different place.
To be in a different place.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will happen.
I can't remember who it was. I was just reading a quote from some author who said, if you climb the ladder of my works and get to the mountain where you want to be, kick away the ladder. You don't need it anymore. And I thought, what a
Wow.
great way to
Right,
say
right,
it.
right.
You know, my goal is to help you get where you need to be.
Right.
You know,
Right.
once you get there, you don't need the ladder.
Right. And you know when you're there.
Yeah.
You get to choose and,
Yeah.
and make that decision and feel it within yourself,
Yeah.
that peace. You know, so we always ask our guests to talk a little bit about what does wholeness mean to you?
You know, there's a little kind of meditative practice that I in my work with the Center for Action and Contemplation, we use sometimes at the beginning of a session or a conference or something, and we say, all of you are welcome here, and all of you is welcome here. And so the first is obviously addressed to a large group of people, but then to say to each person, the parts of you that are afraid are welcome. The parts of you that are critical are welcome. The parts of you that are exhausted are welcome. All these different parts of you are welcome. And the parts of you that are unresolved. And you don't have to be somewhere you aren't, you know. And that wholeness to me, it is when we're in it doesn't mean I'm happy about everything,
Right.
but it means I'm not having to cover up anything or hate something about myself. I mean, I could say I want this to change, but in a certain way, when I say I want that to change, it's because I love myself and don't want myself to be harmed by something, you know, that some unhelpful pattern or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's what all of me is welcome. That is something, some part of wholeness for me.
I love that. It reminds me of the best sentence ever created that for myself is I am. That's it.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, that's what it reminds me when you say that. And,
Yes.
and it feels like a lot like an unconditional love
Yeah.
for others and for the self.
Yeah.
And to let both of those happen and exist at the same time. And that's amazing. Well, I appreciate you taking your time today.
What a pleasure to meet you and know of your good work and to be in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.